Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you haven't already, and let your eyes go a little soft, the way they do right before a room stops being a room and starts being just a shape you're floating inside of. Tonight we're going to sit with a question that sounds simple and isn't. A question that only gets harder the longer you actually look at it, which is usually how you know a question is worth asking in the first place. The question is this: was Finn, the human, ever actually the hero of Adventure Time? Not was he the main character. He obviously was. Not was he brave or good or kind, because he obviously was those things too, most of the time, in the way a person is those things when they're genuinely trying and occasionally failing at it. The question is narrower and stranger than that. It's about the specific word hero, the word the show itself keeps circling back to, testing, breaking apart, handing off to other people, taking away from Finn at the exact moments you'd expect it to matter most. Because if you watch closely, and I mean really watch, episode after episode, decade after decade of ooze internal time, you start to notice something the show never says out loud, but keeps showing you anyway. Finn is rarely the one who actually saves anything. He's usually the one who almost ruins it, or the one who's absent when it matters, or the one standing slightly to the side while somebody else does the thing the poster art implied only he could do. The actual saving, again and again, gets done by somebody standing just outside the frame, somebody the show never bothers to put a cape on. That's where we're going tonight. 12 years of a boy's life, 1,000 years of a legend's life before him, an entire cast of quiet, uncelebrated people doing the work the story keeps pretending belongs to somebody else, and one very old question about what the word hero was ever actually supposed to mean in a place built entirely out of what survived the end of the world. There's a small detail worth mentioning before we even get into the episodes themselves, because it tells you the show's own marketing team already half suspected the answer we're circling tonight. When the Distant Lands specials were being promoted years later, well after the original series had already wrapped, the official descriptions didn't call Finn and Jake heroes outright. They called them unlikely heroes, a phrase that sounds like a throwaway piece of ad copy right up until you notice how carefully it's hedging. Unlikely implies a gap between who someone appears to be and what the story eventually asks of them. It implies surprise, implies that the credentials weren't obviously there to begin with. Nobody ever needed to call Superman an unlikely hero or a knight in shining armor an unlikely hero, because those figures come preloaded with the qualifications the word usually assumes. But a boy in a bear hat and a dog who can turn into a house needed that qualifier attached to them from the very beginning, and I don't think that's an accident of copywriting. I think it's the show and the people who spent years marketing it quietly acknowledging something the whole run of episodes was going to spend a decade proving in far more detail than any tagline ever could. And it's worth noticing that the specials themselves went on to apply that exact same phrasing, unlikely hero, to characters who had absolutely nothing to do with Finn or Jake at all, to a small robot floating alone through deep space, to a bookworm setting out to find a legend nobody expected to still be alive, let alone willing to help. The marketing kept reaching for the same word over and over for a whole rotating cast of people, as though the word itself had never really belonged to any one of them in the first place. It's worth pausing before we go any further on the actual word itself, because we use it so casually that it's easy to forget it was ever a specific technical term before it became a marketing category. In the oldest sense the word carried, a hero wasn't simply someone brave or someone good or even someone who won. A hero was someone set apart, someone whose story got remembered specifically because the ordinary rules of a life didn't seem to apply to them the way they applied to everyone else, someone whose name outlived the person attached to it and started doing work of its own, inspiring the next generation, giving people something to measure themselves against in the dark. That's a heavy thing to hang on in any one person, and it's an even heavier thing to hang on a growing boy who's still working out how relationships end and how apologies function and whether it's ever okay to manufacture a fight between two people for your own private entertainment. Adventure Time, I think, understood that weight better than most shows bother to, and spent 10 seasons quietly asking whether any single person, however brave, however kind, was ever built to carry it alone. And it's worth saying that Finn himself, to his credit, seems to sense some version of all this long before the show ever spells it out for the audience directly. He's not a boy who walks around convinced of his own specialness the way certain chosen one protagonists in other stories tend to. He's plagued, across the run of the show, by exactly the kind of low-grade, persistent uncertainty about his own identity that would make sense in someone who's quietly absorbed, without ever being told outright that the title he's been handed might not be entirely his to keep. He worries, for long stretches of the early seasons, about whether he's the only human left in the world, a question that isn't really about loneliness so much as it's about specialness, about whether being singular in that specific way means anything at all once you actually sit down and examine it. He has recurring dreams and visions across the show's run, so many of them that longtime fans have started cataloging entire clusters of dream-focused episodes as their own separate strand of the mythology. Dreams about his own eventual death, dreams about alternate versions of himself, dreams about a farm world where he never became who he became at all. None of that reads like the interior life of someone secure in his own designated role. It reads like the interior shape of someone who suspects, somewhere underneath all the sword fights, that the role might be borrowed, might be temporary, might belong just as easily to somebody else standing nearby who simply hasn't been asked yet. The easiest place to start is the place the show itself starts, which is with the assumption everybody walks in carrying before they've watched a single frame. Finn is the hero. He's got the hat, the sword, the dog, the theme song, the title practically stitched into the premise of the whole show. Adventure Time. His adventure. His time. The structure of nearly every early episode reinforces it without even trying. Something's wrong in the land of Oo. A princess is in trouble. A monster's loose. A kingdom's under threat. And Finn shows up with Jake at his side and fixes it, usually with a sword. occasionally with a plan so bad it circles back around into working anyway, purely on the strength of enthusiasm and luck. That's the shape of a hero story. It's the shape of basically every hero story that's ever been told, going back long before cartoons existed, long before television existed, back to campfires and clay tablets, and whatever the very first version of a story about a brave person doing a brave thing actually looked like. And Adventure Time knew that shape well enough to wear it comfortably for its first couple of seasons, the way a kid wears a costume that still fits. But even in those early seasons, if you go back and rewatch them with the eyes you have now, instead of the eyes you had the first time, there's a specific episode that quietly undermines the whole premise before the show is even 25 episodes deep into its run. It's called His Hero, and it originally aired in 2011, and it's the episode that introduces us to Billy. Billy is the reason Finn exists as a character in the exact shape he does. Before Finn ever picked up a sword, Billy was already legendary in the land of Oo, already a figure other people told stories about, around fires and in taverns, already the kind of name that made children's eyes go wide. He's enormous, six-fingered, ancient by the standards of anyone else still walking around Oo in the show's present day. According to the legends that had built up around him, by the time Finn and Jake go looking for him, he rescued Cotton Candy Princess from the terrifying fire count. He defeated an evil ocean. He beat a giant bear with his bare hands. He kept a dog at his side the same way Finn kept Jake. He kept piles of treasure, the way Finn kept his own modest hoard back at the tree fort. Even his hands carry the mark of legend rather than ordinary biology. 6 fingers on each one, where most residents of Oo, Finn included, only ever have 4, a small physical detail that some fans have connected, speculatively and without the show ever confirming it outright, to older folkloric traditions about giants and unusually large, unusually gifted figures said to walk among ordinary people in stories told long before anyone had heard of the land of Oo at all. Whatever the truth of that particular thread, the show clearly built Billy to be excessive in every visible way, larger, older, more accomplished, more mythic, specifically so that the gap between his legend and his actual final years would land as hard as it does. Jake, in fact, has what the show plays as a genuine, earnest crush on Billy, the kind of hero worship that borders on devotion, the kind where you don't just admire someone, you organize a piece of your own identity around the hope of one day resembling them. And when Finn and Jake actually find Billy, expecting to meet the greatest warrior Oo has ever produced, what they find instead is an old man who has given up. Billy, by the time Finn meets him, has stopped fighting evil entirely. He's decided, in what the show frames as a genuine ideological shift rather than simple burnout, that violence isn't actually the answer he once thought it was, and he spends the episode trying to convince Finn and Jake of the same thing, trying to get them to help people without swords, without fists, without any of the tools that made him famous. Picture the scene as the show actually stages it. A cave, dim and cluttered with the accumulated relics of an entire legendary career, a giant sitting hunched among his own trophies, looking less like a warrior and more like a man who's simply tired of the weight of the story everyone keeps asking him to keep telling. Two young admirers standing in front of him, practically vibrating with the specific joy of finally meeting the person whose legend built the shape of their own ambitions, having absolutely no idea that the man in front of them has already quietly decided the whole project wasn't worth the cost anymore. It doesn't entirely work. Finn ultimately does end up needing to fight a giant to save an old woman because some problems, the show suggests even this early on, really do require force, and pure gentleness isn't always enough to move the world the direction you need it to go. But the more important thing that happens in his hero isn't the giant. It's the fact that the show's first real hero, the legend Finn, is explicitly modeling himself after, the person whose reputation basically built the mold Finn is being poured into, turns out to be somebody who's already burned out on being a hero by the time we meet him. He's tired, he's uncertain, he no longer fully believes in the thing he's famous for, and by the episode's end, once Finn and Jake's earnest fanboying restores something in him, he declares them his own heroes right back, gets so overwhelmed by the mutual admiration that he actually kicks them out of his cave just to have a moment alone with the feeling. That's not a small detail to plant 25 episodes into a show ostensibly about a boy having adventures. That's the show quietly telling you, right at the start, before the mythology gets heavy and the ruins start showing up in the corners of every outdoor shot, that the hero business has an expiration date, that the person at the top of the legend has already lived long enough to doubt the legend from the inside, and that Finn, without knowing it yet, has just shaken hands with his own future. If you want to comment below and tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is there right now, I'd genuinely love to know. I always picture this landing somewhere different for everyone. Some kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon with the light coming in sideways. Some bed in the dark at 3 in the morning with the phone brightness turned all the way down. And there's something quietly comforting about knowing the land of Ooh is keeping different kinds of company all over the world tonight, at every hour, in every time zone, while I sit here talking about a boy who was never quite as simple as his own title card suggested. Go ahead and drop that in the comments whenever you get a second. Now, let's keep going, because the Billy thread doesn't end with his hero. It ends somewhere much darker, years later, and it's the second layer down in why this whole hero question gets so complicated. Billy comes back into the story properly in the 4th season in an episode simply called The Lich, and what happens to him there is one of the more quietly brutal turns the show ever takes. Brutal specifically because of how understated it is, how little fanfare the show gives to something that should, by any normal narrative logic, be treated as a catastrophe. By this point, Billy has receded into legend again, an old hermit living in a cave, largely forgotten by the world he once protected, his glory days long behind him, his 6-fingered hands presumably a little slower than they used to be, his enormous frame gone soft and stooped in the specific way age settles into even the largest bodies eventually. The Lich, the show's oldest and most patient antagonist, an entity the show eventually reveals existed before the universe itself had a name for existing, finds him there. And because Billy is old and slow and no longer the warrior he was, the Lich is able to kill him, not defeat him in some symbolic sense that leaves room for a rematch. Kill him. And then, in a detail that the show handles with more genuine horror than almost anything else in its entire run, the Lich takes Billy's body and wears it, uses his corpse as a disguise, sits on his throne, eats a sandwich in his skin, blinking with Billy's eyes, while something else entirely looks out through them, chewing with a mouth that used to belong to somebody who spent his whole life trying to protect people from exactly this kind of horror. And using that borrowed, hollowed out face, the Lich manipulates Finn into opening a wormhole that nearly lets it destroy the entire world. Sit with that for a second, because it matters more than it might seem to on first viewing, back when you were 9 or 14, or whatever age you were, the first time this show found you. The great original hero of Ooh, the man whose legend built the very shape of what Finn thinks heroism is supposed to look like, doesn't die in a blaze of glory fighting evil to the last breath, sword raised, crowd cheering. He dies quietly, off guard, alone, killed by the thing he'd spent his whole life failing to permanently defeat, and then his own body is used as a puppet against the person who admired him most in the entire world. Billy's death, once Finn actually processes it in the 6th season episode's Bad Timing and Billy's Bucket List, breaks something in him that the show doesn't rush to fix. He goes looking for a bucket list Billy apparently wrote before the end, tries to complete the items on it as a kind of tribute, a young woman named Canyon at his side who actually knew Billy in those last uncertain years. And along the way, Finn has to confront the fact that his hero, the person he'd built so much of his own identity around emulating, spent his final years directionless, aimless, uncertain what he was even supposed to be doing with the time he had left, a man whose glory days had already curdled into something quieter and sadder long before the Lich ever found him. There's a moment where Canyon lists off Billy's flaws and failures to Finn, plainly, without softening them, the way you'd tell someone the truth about a person they'd built into something bigger than a person. And Finn's response is to say, quietly, that even heroes have slumps. It's a small line. It's also one of the most important lines Finn ever speaks in the entire show, because it's the exact moment he stops thinking of heroism as a fixed, permanent state that some people simply have and other people simply don't, and starts understanding it as something closer to a mood, a posture, a thing you can lose and regain and lose again, something that comes and goes the way weather comes and goes, unpredictable and never fully within your control. Later, in Billy's bucket list, Finn actually gets to spend one more afternoon with the version of Billy his imagination has been carrying around. A joyride through the desert, some cool quest nonsense before Canyon and Finn part ways, and it's a small mercy the show allows him, a chance to have a real memory of the man, rather than only the legend and the horror of what came after. That reframing is worth carrying forward with you, because it's going to matter again and again as we go deeper tonight. If heroism isn't a fixed identity, but something closer to a state you're in and out of, then the question of who the real hero of Adventure Time is stops being a question about which character gets the title on a poster and starts being a question about who, in any given moment, actually happens to be standing inside that state. And once you start asking it that way, Finn's claim on the title starts looking considerably less secure than the marketing would suggest. Let's go somewhere the show doesn't get talked about nearly as much, because I think it's one of the clearest, most deliberately uncomfortable pieces of evidence for everything we're building tonight. And it involves the people Finn actually shares blood with rather than the legend he chose to admire. The Islands miniseries, which aired during the show's 7th season, sends Finn and Jake away from the land of Oo entirely, out across open water, chasing down the oldest question Finn has ever carried without quite being able to name it, which is whether he's the only human being left anywhere in the world. What they find is Founder's Island, a place where a group of humans fled roughly 1,000 years earlier in the chaos surrounding the Mushroom War, and over the following centuries built something that looks, on its glossy candy-colored surface, almost like a utopia. Except it isn't one. It's a closed system, a place with strict rules about who gets to leave and who has to stay, enforced by cybernetically enhanced figures the community calls Seekers, whose entire purpose is to hunt down and drag back anyone who tries to escape the island's boundaries. One of those Seekers, we learn, was a woman named Kara, trained from childhood, given cybernetic augmentation and forced strength she never consented to in any meaningful sense, manipulated by an authority figure called Dr. Gross into betraying her closest friend, a woman named Frida, who had made the mistake of wanting to see what existed beyond the shoreline. Kara eventually leaves the island entirely, loses most of her memory, and rebuilds herself in the land of Oo under a different name. You already know her. She's Susan Strong, one of the earliest and strangest recurring figures in the whole run of the show, first introduced years earlier as a mysterious, imposing woman speaking in broken fragments of language, guarding something called lube glubs that Finn initially assumes are simply overprotected toys. By the time Islands catches up with her, Susan is given the chance to return to Founder's Island and actually reckon with what she did to Frida, and it's her arc, not Finn's, that carries the genuine emotional weight of the miniseries. She's the one who has to sit with real guilt. She's the one who has to find her old friend and ask for something like forgiveness. She's the one who chooses, at the end of it all, to keep the name Susan rather than reclaim the name Kara, because Kara was a person built entirely inside someone else's system of control, and Susan is a person she built herself, out on the open water, away from anyone telling her what she owed anybody. Think about what that actually requires of a person, setting aside for a moment that the person in question is a semi-mute figure the show spent its early seasons treating as a joke about grunting and misunderstanding pool toys. It requires going back to the exact place that built you into a weapon in the first place, walking past the same training grounds, the same authority figures, the same systems of control that once put a remote device in someone else's hand and let them steer your body against your own will. It requires finding the specific person you hurt and sitting with her rather than explaining yourself out of the hurt, letting Frida's forgiveness, if it comes at all, come on Frida's own timeline rather than Susan's. Picture the two of them, finally face to face after years apart, on an island neither of them ever chose in the first place, one carrying the guilt of a betrayal she was manipulated into, and the other carrying the smaller, quieter grief of having simply given up on a dream she once thought was worth risking everything for. The show doesn't let Susan talk her way into absolution. It lets her be present instead, patient, willing to hear exactly how much her actions cost. And it's only once Frida's own buried love of adventure resurfaces on its own terms, unforced, unprompted by any speech, that the two of them find their way back toward each other. That's a genuine redemption arc, hard won and specific and quietly devastating, and it belongs to a character the show spent years treating as comic relief and background texture before finally handing her the emotional center of an entire storyline. Finn's role in Islands, meanwhile, is considerably less flattering than you'd expect from the character the whole show is nominally named after. He meets his biological mother there, Minerva Campbell, a doctor who had dedicated herself so completely to caring for the human settlement that she eventually uploaded her own consciousness into a network of small robotic helpers just to extend her reach, just to be able to be everywhere at once for people who needed her. She's kind, she's warm, she is also, the show is honest enough to admit, overprotective in a way that has calcified an entire community into something closed and fearful rather than merely safe. And Finn's response to discovering this isn't especially gracious. He gives what the show depicts as a long, impassioned speech in front of a crowd of the island's human citizens about how they have no freedom, arguing forcefully that they should be allowed to leave, that safety bought at the price of an entire life spent behind a boundary isn't worth what it costs. He isn't entirely wrong, but he's also, as more than one person who's written carefully about this miniseries has pointed out, a single outsider raised his whole life among the creatures of Ooh rather than among these people standing in front of an entire species he barely knows and telling them what he's decided is best for all of them. It's the exact same instinct we're going to see him repeat with Flame Princess a season earlier and a season later, the instinct to decide on someone else's behalf what their own liberation is supposed to look like, without asking very hard whether he's actually earned the standing to make that call. The miniseries ultimately resolves with Minerva's approval, with the island's guardian system switched off, with the humans finally given the choice to leave if they want to. But it's worth noticing, again, who actually does the difficult, patient work of getting there. It isn't Finn's speech that heals the wound between Kara and Frida. It's Susan, sitting with her old friend, choosing not to persuade her so much as simply be present with her long enough for Frida's own buried love of adventure to resurface on its own terms. Finn provides the noise, Susan provides the actual repair. And there's one more piece of this particular corner of the mythology worth sitting with before we move on, because it's easy to let it slide past unnoticed if you're only watching for Finn's own arc. His father, Martin Mertens, is introduced across these same later seasons as a rogue, a con artist, a man who was imprisoned in something called the Cosmic Citadel for reasons the show reveals slowly and with real discomfort. Martin is charming in the specific way genuinely selfish people are often charming, quick with a joke, easy to like in small doses, the kind of man who can make a whole room laugh in the first 5 minutes of meeting him and leave every single person in that room worse off by the time he's finished, and entirely uninterested in being Finn's father in any way that would actually cost him something. He tells stories about grand plans and narrow escapes with the easy fluency of somebody who's told those same stories to 100 other people in 100 other rooms, and there's always, somewhere underneath the charm, the faint sense that he's already halfway out the door, even while he's still talking to you. Finn spends real energy across these seasons wanting a relationship with him anyway, the way you keep reaching for warmth even from a source that's never once been reliably warm back, showing up again and again with the specific hopeful patience of a kid who hasn't yet let himself fully believe the pattern is a pattern. And the show doesn't rescue Finn from that disappointment. It lets Martin be exactly as hollow as he is. In the episode Escape from the Citadel, when Finn tries to physically stop his father from fleeing rather than facing consequences, the grass sword entangles around Finn's arm and, in trying to hold on to a man who was never going to stay, costs Finn his entire forearm. That's not a metaphor I'm inserting after the fact. That's the literal mechanics of the scene. Reaching for his father costs Finn a piece of his own body. Martin eventually accepts an offer from a passing catalyst comet and transcends to some higher plane of existence entirely, disappearing from the universe rather than ever having to be accountable to the son he left behind, and the show lets that be the last we see of him. No tearful reconciliation, no growth arc, just a man who prioritized himself all the way to the edge of existence and then kept going. If heroism is supposed to run in families, the way it so often does in these kinds of stories, if there's supposed to be some lineage of decency handed down from father to son, the way Billy's legend was handed down to Finn through pure admiration, then Adventure Time is very clear about where Finn's actual decency didn't come from. It didn't come from Martin. Whatever Finn is, whatever genuine goodness he manages to carry through the show's run, he built it in spite of his biological father, not because of him, largely raised instead by Jake's own parents, Joshua and Margaret, a pair of ordinary, warm, occasionally ridiculous magical dogs who simply showed up for a lost human infant they found in the woods and decided, without any grand ceremony about it, to raise him as their own. That's worth remembering as we go forward, because it's part of the larger argument. Heroism, in this show's actual value system, doesn't run through blood, doesn't run through legendary lineage, doesn't run through the sword you inherit or the name that gets stitched onto a title card. It runs through whoever happens to show up and do the unglamorous work of caring for someone else, whether or not the story ever bothers to notice them doing it. Now let's look at what Finn actually does when he's given the reins directly, when nobody else is around to quietly outperform him, because this is where the show gets most uncomfortable about its own protagonist, and I think it's worth staying with that discomfort rather than rushing past it. Here's the thing the show does that almost no other kids' cartoon of its era was willing to do. It lets its main character be, at various points, genuinely, uncomfortably wrong. Not wrong in the safe, sitcom sense, where the hero makes a silly mistake and learns a gentle lesson by the end of 22 minutes. Wrong in a way that actually costs other people something real. Wrong in a way the show refuses to fully forgive him for just because he's the protagonist and the theme song has his name in it. The clearest single example of this, and one of the more divisive episodes in the show's history because of exactly how far it's willing to go, is the 5th season episode Frost and Fire. The setup is almost embarrassingly petty when you say it plainly. Finn, at this point dating Flame Princess, watches her get into a fight with the Ice King and afterward has an extremely pleasurable dream about it. A dream so satisfying that when it cuts off before he gets to see how it ends, he becomes almost obsessively fixated on recreating the exact circumstances that produced it. There's something worth sitting with in just how ordinary that impulse actually is, stripped of its cartoon packaging. It's the same impulse that makes a person replay a good memory too many times until the replaying starts to matter more than whatever actually happened. The same impulse that turns wanting a feeling back into a kind of quiet, private obsession that starts making decisions for you before you've noticed it's taken the wheel. Finn isn't a monster in this episode. He's a teenager who wanted to feel something exciting again badly enough that he stopped asking whether the cost of getting it was fair to the people he was extracting it from. So he engineers another fight between his girlfriend and the Ice King. On purpose, for his own private gratification. Flame Princess very nearly kills the Ice King in the process, destroys a significant portion of the Ice Kingdom, and when she eventually discovers that Finn manufactured the entire conflict from nothing, purely to chase a feeling, she ends the relationship, and the show does not soften her anger or suggest she's overreacting. Finn apologizes. She tells him, plainly, that saying sorry doesn't fix what he did, that knowing what you did wrong matters as much as the apology itself. The Ice King, of all characters, the show's resident figure of comic pity, is the one who gets to deliver the closing verdict on the whole situation, looking at Finn and simply saying that he blew it. And the episode lets that stand. It doesn't rescue Finn from the consequence. It doesn't give him a last-minute redemption scene before the credits roll. It just lets him have caused real harm to someone he claimed to love for a reason that boils down to wanting to feel something exciting again, and it lets that harm actually cost him the relationship rather than being forgiven away in the final 90 seconds. It's worth noticing, too, that Frost and Fire wasn't actually the first time this exact impulse showed up in Finn, which makes it considerably harder to dismiss as an isolated lapse rather than something closer to a genuine, recurring flaw. Years earlier, in a much gentler second season episode simply called Storytelling, Jake falls sick, and the only known cure, according to the show's own internal logic, is hearing a truly satisfying story, one with romance and fighting and suspense, and a proper happy ending. Finn sets out into the woods to find one, and when the world simply refuses to hand him the narrative he needs on schedule, he starts manufacturing it himself, nudging animals into conflicts they weren't actually having, inventing romance where there was none, quietly stage managing the forest into producing the shape of drama he's decided he needs. It's played almost entirely for comedy in that episode, gentle and low stakes, the kind of thing a 7-year-old watching along with a parent would laugh at without a second thought. But the underlying instinct is identical to what shows up years later with Flame Princess and the Ice King, all grown up and considerably more dangerous by then. Finn has always had this specific pull toward wanting reality to arrange itself into a satisfying story, and toward being willing, when reality doesn't cooperate on its own, to reach in and rearrange the pieces himself. In the forest, with squirrels and rabbits standing in for the stakes, that impulse is charming. By the 5th season, with an actual girlfriend and an actual grieving old man standing in for the stakes instead, it very nearly gets someone killed. There's a companion piece to this in the same season, an episode called Vault of Bones, where Finn's concern for Flame Princess takes a related but gentler shape. He's worried, watching her interact with a group of villainous fire elementals, that she still has evil tendencies buried somewhere underneath the goodness she's been working toward, that despite her efforts she might revert. And what he does with that worry is quietly controlling. He tries to steer her, manage her, nudge her toward the specific version of goodness he's already decided she ought to be performing, rather than trusting her to work out her own relationship to her own nature on her own terms and in her own time. It's a smaller episode than Frost and Fire, less dramatic in its consequences, but it's built from the same underlying material, which is a Finn who has, without fully realizing it, started to believe that being the hero means he also gets to decide what's good for the people around him, including the people he's supposedly protecting, including the person he's supposedly closest to. Princess Bubblegum runs a parallel version of this same instinct with Flame Princess in the episode Earth and Water, subjecting her to a series of tests specifically designed to gauge whether her fiery tendencies still pose some latent threat, treating her less like a person navigating her own transformation and more like a variable to be measured, contained, and filed away. And it's worth noticing, if you're keeping track of who actually behaves like the responsible, trustworthy adult in these particular episodes, that it isn't Finn and it isn't Bubblegum. In the 6th season episode The Cooler, when disaster strikes the Fire Kingdom, Flame Princess turns not to her ex-boyfriend, the supposed hero of all Ooh, but to Cinnamon Bun, a character the show has spent years positioning as pure comic relief, as the least competent, least dignified figure in the entire cast, someone whose name is a punchline before it's ever anything else. And Cinnamon Bun rises to the occasion. He becomes, in that moment, more genuinely useful and more genuinely trustworthy than either of the two characters the show has spent 5 seasons training you to think of as the responsible adults of the land of Ooh. This is a pattern. Once you see it in one place, you start seeing it everywhere, and it's the actual architecture of the argument I'm trying to build with you tonight. The show keeps setting up situations where the person everyone expects to be the hero, whether that's Finn specifically, or someone standing in Finn's structural position within a given story, turns out to be the wrong person for the job, and the actual solution comes from somewhere. The narrative had spent years quietly training you not to look. It isn't only Finn who gets this treatment either, and I think it's worth pausing on the other half of the show's supposed leadership before we move any further, because Princess Bubblegum's own failures are handled with exactly the same unflinching honesty. In the sixth season finale, an episode called Hot Diggity Doom, the Candy Kingdom holds its very first election, a legal, constitutionally sound process Bubblegum herself has agreed to allow, confident that a population she raised from nothing will naturally recognize her genuine love for them over the hollow promises of a con artist called the King of Ooh. She loses, not narrowly, by a landslide. Distracted at a critical moment by the appearance of a catalyst comet in the sky, she watches her own people, the candy citizens she quite literally built with her own hands out of the wreckage of the old world, vote overwhelmingly for a man who has no actual interest in governing responsibly, purely because his speeches sounded better than her track record felt. And in the show's most quietly devastating touch, Bubblegum arrives at a horrifying realization about why this happened at all. She made the candy people, in some fundamental sense, too simple, too eager to please, too incapable of recognizing a bad leader, even when one was standing right in front of them, promising the moon. Her failure as a ruler and her failure as a scientist turn out to be the exact same failure, folded into one another so tightly you can't pull them apart. She goes into exile. She has to be quietly talked back into returning months later when the king of Oo's greed finally produces a crisis large enough that even her own bruised pride can't keep her away from cleaning it up. This isn't a small aside either. Bubblegum is, alongside Finn, the closest thing this show has to a second protagonist, a second candidate for the word hero, brilliant and capable, and genuinely devoted to the people under her care in a way that's never really in question. And the show still lets her be wrong about something fundamental, lets an entire kingdom's worth of people suffer under a con man's rule, because the responsible, competent leader everyone assumed would always be there, made a mistake she never saw coming, born out of exactly the kind of unexamined power she'd been exercising over her own creations since the day she made them. It's worth sitting for a moment with what that actually looked like on the ground once the King of Ooh settled into the throne he'd talked his way into. He nearly bankrupts the kingdom through simple, ordinary greed, the kind that doesn't require any grand, villainous scheme. Just a man treating a nation's resources the way a careless person treats a shared refrigerator. Bubblegum, technically retired, technically no longer anyone's responsibility to fix anything, watches this happen from exile and has to decide over and over whether her wounded pride is worth more to her than the people she still loves even after they voted her out. It isn't. She keeps coming back. Not because the story needs its rightful ruler restored to the throne in some tidy, satisfying arc, but because she genuinely cannot stand to watch her own creations suffer, even when suffering them a little longer, might have taught the Candy Kingdom something useful about what they'd actually thrown away. Heroism and competence, the show keeps insisting, quietly and without ever making a speech out of it, are not the same thing as goodness, and none of the three are the same thing as being right. Somebody can love their people completely and still get the fundamentals badly wrong. Somebody can be brave and still cause real harm. The show trusts its audience, even its very young audience, to hold both of those truths about the same person at the same time without needing either one to cancel the other out. Nowhere is this made more literal, more almost embarrassingly on the nose, than in the 9th season miniseries called Elements. If you haven't seen it, or haven't seen it recently, the setup is that a magical catastrophe has split the land of Oo into 4 warring elemental territories: ice, fire, candy, and slime, each one saturated with an extreme, exaggerated version of a single emotional temperament: melancholic, choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, the old humors dressed up in candy colors. And it's up to Finn and a small handful of others to gather elemental gems and undo the damage before it becomes permanent. And here's what happens to Finn specifically, in an episode that's actually titled, with a bluntness that borders on the show winking directly at the camera, Happy Warrior. He enters the Fire Kingdom, gets overtaken by the fire elemental's influence, and transforms into what fans and the show's own promotional material have simply called Fire Finn, a version of the hero consumed entirely by rage, entirely focused on destruction, entirely indistinguishable, in that state, from the villains he's spent 9 seasons defeating. Picture it clearly, because the show draws it clearly. His skin burns a deep, angry orange, his hat scorched at the edges, his eyes gone hard and narrow in a way they've never once looked across 9 seasons of him being scared or sad or heartbroken. He's not defending anyone anymore. He's trying to annihilate the population of the very kingdom he's supposed to be helping, swinging at candy citizens who never did anything except exist in his path. The hero of the land of Oo has become, for however long it takes to walk that episode's runtime, the exact threat the hero of the land of Oo exists to stop. And who fixes it? Not Jake, who's been absorbed into the slime kingdom and is unavailable for the entire crisis. Not Princess Bubblegum, occupied elsewhere with her own front of the same catastrophe. Not the Ice King, who along with Betty simply abandons Finn and Lumpy Space Princess to fend for themselves the moment things get genuinely difficult, flying off toward their own separate concerns. It's Lumpy Space Princess, LSP. The character the show has built almost entirely out of vanity, self-absorption, and comic instability for 8 seasons, the character reviewers have openly, repeatedly called the single most one-dimensional member of the entire main cast. Turns out to be immune to the elemental corruption altogether, the only major character who passes through every single one of the 4 elemental territories without being changed or absorbed by any of them. She's the one who reminds Firefin of what the very next episode's own title calls his hero heart. The one whose steady, if abrasive, sense of self is apparently sturdy enough to withstand transformations that flatten literally everyone else who touches them. The episode where she pulls this off is titled, plainly, Hero Heart, and it isn't describing Finn's heart, it's describing hers. The show even builds this discrepancy into its own framing device, listing off four main heroes in its recap sequences, while, as at least one longtime reviewer of the series has pointed out, barely alluding to LSP's actual role at all, letting her heroism sneak past you the same way it sneaks past everyone in OO who's been trained by a decade of narrative convention to assume she's incapable of being the one who saves anybody. Even the character herself doesn't seem especially interested in claiming credit for it afterward, and the show doesn't force the point either, doesn't give her a triumphant speech or a parade or a statue of her own to match the one implicitly promised to whoever finally saved OO. She just goes back, once the crisis passes, to being exactly as vain and abrasive and gloriously difficult as she was before any of it happened, because that's who she actually is underneath the moment the story needed her to be something else, and the show clearly respects her enough not to flatten her into a changed woman just because she got to be useful once. That, too, is part of the argument. The people who quietly hold this world together when the designated hero fails don't necessarily get transformed by the experience into better, more legible versions of themselves. They just go back to being who they already were, having done the thing without needing the thing to have meant anything about their identity going forward. I want to sit with that for one more moment before we move on, because I think it's one of the clearest single pieces of evidence the show ever gives us for the argument we're building tonight. Elements didn't need to make Finn the villain. It chose to. It didn't need to hand the rescue to the character everyone had spent 8 seasons dismissing as shallow. It chose to do that too. Adventure Time is a show that plans its background art with the kind of obsessive care that rewards people who pause on individual frames, so it's worth taking seriously the possibility, and I want to be honest, that this next part is interpretation rather than confirmed authorial statement, that the writers understood exactly what they were doing when they built an entire miniseries around proving that the designated hero could become the exact monster he exists to fight, while the character with the least narrative capital to spend turned out to be the only person sturdy enough to hold the line, when everyone who was supposed to be reliable simply wasn't there. And once you notice this particular pattern once, in Lumpy Space Princess of all people, you start watching for it everywhere else, and it turns out to show up again and again across this show's decade-long run, in different seasons, written by different rooms of people, in characters who seem to have nothing else in common except the specific shape of being dismissed, right up until the exact moment they're needed. We'll meet a few more of them before the night is through. For now, the point worth carrying forward is simple enough to hold in one hand. The most reliable person in the room is very rarely the person the room was built to notice. Competence hides in the places narrative convention trains you to stop looking. If you want to find out who's actually capable of saving something, you have to be willing to look away from the poster for long enough to see who's quietly already doing it. Now, if Elements shows us Finn becoming the villain temporarily in a single miniseries, there's a much deeper much stranger piece of the show's mythology that takes this same idea and stretches it across years of continuity. And that's where we need to go next, into the story of Fern. Fern begins as an accident, though calling it an accident undersells how deliberately the show built the accident to matter. Finn's grass sword, a strange living weapon that had been growing and changing shape across several seasons, comes into contact again with his original Finn sword, the enchanted blade that's carried a small, dreaming version of Finn inside it since much earlier in the series. The two swords merge. What emerges from that merger is a being made of grass, carrying all of Finn's memories, all of Finn's instincts, all of Finn's fundamental orientation toward wanting to be good and wanting to be seen as good, but wrapped around a core the show associates with something called the Grass Demon, a distorting presence whose exact nature is left deliberately, characteristically vague. This being takes the name Fern, and he looks, at first glance, almost exactly like Finn, just a little greener, a little rougher at the edges, the way a reflection looks like you right up until you notice the seam. His hair sits the same way. His voice carries the same easy, earnest lilt, at least at first, before something underneath it starts to fray. If you caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of your eye, in a crowd, in bad light, you would call him Finn without a second thought, and that resemblance is the whole engine of everything that goes wrong for him afterward, because it means the only thing standing between Fern and being accepted as real is a story that had already been written, cast, and broadcast years before he ever climbed out of a merged pair of swords into a world that had no room in it for two of the same person. And here is the detail that matters most for tonight's purposes. The detail that turns Fern from a strange side plot into the single clearest structural argument the show ever makes against Finn's exclusive claim to the word hero. When Finn leaves the land of Oo for an extended stretch during that same island's storyline we just spent time with, off searching for the human settlement his mother helped build, he doesn't leave Oo undefended. He hands the job to Fern. He entrusts his double, his shadow, his grass and magic copy, with the actual responsibility of being the hero of Oo in his absence. And Fern tries, genuinely, earnestly tries. He goes on adventures. He protects people. He does, by all available evidence, a reasonably competent job of occupying the role Finn built his entire identity around. But he can't save everyone, can't solve every problem that comes his way, and each failure lands on him differently than it would have landed on Finn, because underneath his failures is a gnawing, corrosive uncertainty about whether he even has the right to call his own successes real, whether anything he does actually counts if he's not the original, not the true article, just a copy standing in a real hero's borrowed shoes, doing a real hero's job with none of a real hero's standing to show for it. The grass demon, whatever it actually is, feeds on exactly that uncertainty, the way certain kinds of rot only take hold in wood that's already been left out in the wet too long, and by the time Finn returns, Fern has curdled into something bitter and increasingly unstable, a person torn apart by wanting, more than almost anything else in his short, strange existence, to be recognized as the real Finn, the real hero, rather than a discarded, secondary version of one. It comes to a head in the episode Three Buckets, where Fern, having finally broken under the weight of that unresolved identity crisis, decides the only way to settle the question is to remove Finn entirely and take his place permanently, completely. He imprisons him rather than killing him outright, in a detail that's almost unbearably sad once you notice it, because even in the act of trying to erase Finn from existence, Fern can't fully commit to the erasure. He leaves him a bucket of garbage to survive on, rather than simply ending him, which wouldn't have kept a person alive for very long at all. And the show, through its own internal logic and through the observations of critics who've written carefully about the episode since, frames this less as a villain's cruelty and more as the last flicker of a person who still, somewhere underneath all his rage and jealousy, doesn't want to be the kind of person who commits the act he's just set out to commit. Finn ultimately kills him by accident, a bionic arm malfunction, interpreting a spoken word wrong, turning what should have been a moment of mercy into an accidental death. Fern shatters into loose grass and a single detached eyeball, and for a moment the show lets you believe that's the end of him. It isn't. He returns, resurrected through the machinations of a character named Uncle Gumbald in a later episode called 17, genetically altered into something called the Green Knight and set against Finn once more, before finally, in the show's very last episode, Fern and Finn together manage to remove the grass demon from him entirely, an act that leaves Fern without a body to hold him together. He disintegrates. What's left behind isn't nothing, though. It's a seed, shaped unmistakably like the Finn sword that gave birth to him in the first place, small enough to hold in one closed hand, and Finn and Jake plant that seed together at the ruined foundation of their destroyed treehouse, kneeling in the dirt the same way you'd bury something you loved rather than something you were merely disposing of. Years later, in the distant future, the show occasionally lets us glimpse that seed has become an enormous tree with a remade sword embedded high in its branches, waiting for whoever finds it next. Sunlight moving through leaves that grew out of a person nobody in this story ever quite let himself be. I want to be careful here and say plainly that some of what I'm about to suggest is interpretation rather than something the show states outright, but I think it's an interpretation the material genuinely supports rather than one I'm forcing onto it from the outside. Fern's entire arc is the show taking its most sacred piece of iconography, the hero and his sword, and asking what happens if you let the sword grow its own version of the hero, a version built from identical memories and identical desires, but denied the one thing that actually made the original's heroism legible to everyone around him, which was simply being first, being recognized, being the one the story had already decided to follow before the story even started. Fern wanted exactly what Finn wanted. He tried to do exactly what Finn tried to do. And because he wasn't standing in the frame, the camera had already been trained to point at. His attempts read as villainy, his desperation read as monstrousness, his death read as a plot point rather than a tragedy, right up until the show forces you to sit with how genuinely sad the whole thing actually is. If heroism were simply a matter of character, of internal goodness, of the raw material a person is made from, Fern should have been just as much a hero as Finn, because he was made from the exact same material, poured from the exact same mold, carrying the exact same memories of every kindness Finn had ever shown anybody. He wasn't recognized as one. And the difference between them wasn't virtue. It was narrative position. It was who the story had already decided, before either of them had any say in the matter, to call the real one. That's a genuinely uncomfortable thing for a show to suggest about its own protagonist, and I don't think Adventure Time suggests it by accident. Let's step back out from Fern for a moment and look at some of the other people the show quietly hands its actual acts of heroism to, people who never get the poster, never get the theme song, never get their name in the title, and see what pattern emerges when you put them all next to each other in the dark, the way you might lay a handful of old photographs side by side on a table just to see what they have in common. There's Root Beer Guy, first introduced as exactly the kind of forgettable background character shows like this one are full of. A candy person working a dull telemarketing job, married, mildly dissatisfied, quietly writing a not particularly good detective novel in his spare time as an outlet for a sense of adventure his real life never gives him. His own episode, simply called Root Beer Guy, lets him briefly live out something like the fantasy his novel represents, catching Finn and Jake in what turns out to be a staged security test and getting promoted to captain of the Banana Guards as a reward. It's a small, sweet, slightly melancholy story about an ordinary person briefly getting to feel like the protagonist of his own life, instead of a face in someone else's crowd scene. And then, years later, in an episode called Something Big, Root Beer Guy dies. Off screen. The show doesn't even show us the moment. We're simply told, after the fact, that he died performing an act of heroism, and the episode itself is dedicated to his memory. No fanfare, no slow-motion sacrifice scene, no music swelling to tell you how to feel about it. Just a background character, the kind of person the camera almost never bothers to follow, doing something brave enough to die for, entirely outside the frame the show usually reserves for its actual protagonist. He's later brought back in an odd, uneven storyline involving his revival as something called Dirt Beer Guy, a plotline more than one critic writing about the show has called genuinely unnecessary, almost as if the show itself got briefly uncomfortable with how quietly it had let him go and needed to walk it back. But the original gesture, the off-screen death, the dedication card, the total absence of ceremony, still stands as one of the more honest things the show ever did with the idea of sacrifice. Real heroism, it suggests, often doesn't get filmed. It just gets a name on a card at the end of an episode, and then the story moves on without you. Think about how many people like that must exist in the background of every single episode of this show, every unnamed candy citizen standing in a crowd while Finn and Jake run past, chasing something loud and visible, every extra glimpsed for half a second in the corner of a wide shot, going to a job, raising a family, quietly managing some private grief or private hope, the camera was never going to slow down long enough to notice. The show only ever pulls a handful of them forward into focus, root beer guy among them, purely by chance, purely because a writer somewhere decided this particular background face deserved one afternoon in the light. There's no reason to think he was the only one in the crowd capable of something brave. He's simply the one the camera happened to be pointing at when the story needed a name to attach to an act of heroism that everyone else in that crowd would never get the chance to have witnessed, let alone credited. There's BMO, the small, gentle, endlessly loved game console who lives in the tree fort and refers to Finn and Jake as their parents without a trace of irony, because the emotional logic of that relationship is genuinely parental, even though the biology obviously isn't there. BMO gets, across the show's run, a handful of episodes built entirely around a rich, self-sustaining inner life that has nothing to do with Finn's adventures at all, imagining an entire hard-boiled detective mystery out of a missing sock and a scattering of household pets, casting a chicken as a femme fatale, narrating the whole thing in a clipped, world-weary voice that belongs more to old film reels than to a small robot who lives to make waffles. It's easy to laugh at, and it is genuinely funny, but underneath the joke is something the show takes seriously in its own quiet way, which is the possibility that a being built to be a video game console decided, somewhere along the way, to become something more than that simply because it was loved consistently enough to believe it deserved to. BMO doesn't fight monsters in these episodes. BMO solves imaginary crimes, keeps house, holds the whole treehouse together in small, unglamorous ways, while Finn is off doing the loud, visible version of heroism the theme song promised you. Nobody calls what BMO does heroic. The show doesn't ask you to. It just keeps showing you, year after year, that the tree fort would not function, would not feel like a home at all, without the small robot quietly running the emotional infrastructure underneath everything Finn gets credit for. There's a companion piece to this small-scale, homebound version of BMO, and it comes years later in the very first of the 4 Distant Lands specials, simply titled BMO, which sends the character out into deep space entirely on its own, away from Finn and Jake and the tree fort and everything familiar, on what BMO earnestly believes is a solemn, dedicated mission to help terraform Mars. The special's own marketing described the premise about as plainly as I could ever hope to paraphrase it. When there's a deadly emergency in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, there's only one hero to call, and it's probably not BMO, except that this time it is. That's not a stray piece of ad copy I'm reading too much into. That's the franchise itself, in the language it chose to sell its own spin-off, naming the exact gap we've been circling all night, the gap between who a story assumes its heroes will be and who actually, when the moment arrives, turns out to be capable of carrying one. BMO crash lands on a dying space station called the Drift after a small, lonely service droid throws its rocket off course, and once there, in the middle of a genuine crisis involving failing life support and warring factions, and a con artist quietly siphoning the station's remaining energy for himself, BMO does something the show has never once asked of it before. It appoints itself sheriff. It wears the little droid, whom it's named Olive, like a hat. And in a single unguarded moment, amid all of that, the show lets BMO say out loud the exact insecurity Fern bent an entire arc drowning in without ever finding the words for it. You're not a hero, you're a sidekick. That's BMO talking to BMO. In a rare flash of open self-doubt, the small robot momentarily convinced that whatever role it's about to attempt doesn't actually belong to something built to hold hands and play video games and comfort a shrinking, panicking Jake with a song. And then, in spite of that doubt, or maybe because it never fully believed its own insult, BMO saves the day anyway, alongside a scavenger girl and a shape-shifting droid and a found family assembled in the space of a single emergency, the same way the tree fort itself was assembled, piece by piece, out of whoever happened to show up and stay. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the same argument the finale makes, told in miniature on a much smaller stage, years before the finale ever aired. The show keeps handing this exact insight to whichever character happens to be standing in the frame at the time. You think you know who the hero is supposed to be. The story keeps quietly insisting you're wrong, and then it goes and proves the insistence by simply letting the unlikely candidate do the thing. There's Cinnamon Bun, too, and his particular arc deserves its own moment here, because the show is almost aggressively explicit about what it's doing with him, more explicit than it usually allows itself to be about anything. For the first several seasons, Cinnamon Bun exists purely as comic relief, the Candy Kingdom's resident, half-baked simpleton, clumsy enough in his very first appearance to nearly kill Princess Bubblegum by accident, routinely mocked, routinely underestimated, routinely the butt of whatever joke the writers needed a body for that week. And then, in the 5th season episode The Red Throne, something in him changes. Refined, quite literally, by exposure to the Fire Kingdom's own flames, he emerges no longer half-baked, but fully baked, and the difference isn't just physical. He becomes lucid, focused, capable in ways nobody who'd watched him for 4 seasons would have predicted, and in that same episode, he delivers a genuinely eloquent speech that rallies an oppressed population and turns the tide of an entire crisis. A moment more than one person who's written carefully about the show has described as him outshining Finn himself within the very episode that's supposed to still belong to the actual protagonist. Lumpy space princess, watching him ride off sometime later in an entirely different storyline, simply says, out loud, "When did he get cool?" Everyone slept on that. That line isn't there by accident. It's the show letting one of its own most dismissed characters say the exact thing the whole night we've spent together has been trying to say about a much larger portion of this cast. Cinnamon Bun goes on to become Flame Princess's actual knight, her champion, a competent and serious protector standing at her side through the miniseries and beyond, present in elements as one of the steady, reliable adults in a crisis where so many of the supposedly reliable adults simply weren't. Nobody ever puts his face on a poster. Nobody writes a theme song about him. He simply, quietly, becomes exactly as necessary as anyone the marketing ever bothered to name. There's Obsidian, too, the second of the Distant Lands specials, which frames its entire premise around this same idea in a way that's almost too on the nose to need any commentary from me at all. A young bookworm named Glassboy sets out, once a dangerous dragon breaks free beneath his home, to find the legendary hero who first defeated that same dragon centuries earlier. And the legendary hero he's looking for isn't Finn. It's Marceline, now living in something like domestic peace with Princess Bubblegum, apprehensive about ever returning to the place that holds some of her oldest, worst memories. The special calls her exactly what the word means in its oldest sense, a legendary hero, someone whose name has outlived the specific danger she once faced down. Someone a whole new generation has grown up telling stories about the way Jake once told stories about Billy. Marceline is not the character this entire franchise put its name on. She's a 1,000-year-old survivor who plays bass and processes grief through music, and spent most of the main series simply existing at the edges of Finn's story. And when the show finally needed to hand the word legendary hero to somebody, fully and without qualification, it reached past its own title character and gave it to her instead. There's Peppermint Butler, presented for most of the show's run as a small, sweet, courteous servant to Princess Bubblegum, harmless in every visible way, until the show starts letting you see the edges of what he actually is. He's a practitioner of dark magic with connections to the land of the dead that go well beyond anything a candy butler should reasonably possess. He's, by the show's own quiet implication, on genuinely friendly terms with death itself. He once summoned a portal to the underworld for Finn and Jake in exchange for their own flesh should they fail to return, and the show plays it as a joke. Finn and Jake dismiss without a second thought, which is exactly the show's way of telling you it isn't a joke at all. Peppermint Butler never gets called a hero. He's never asked to be one. But he's the one who quietly keeps the Candy Kingdom's darkest machinery running in the background, the one who knows things nobody else in the kingdom is equipped to know, the one who does the unglamorous, morally compromised work that keeps a candy utopia from collapsing under threats its own princess would rather not look at directly. The show returns to him properly in the fourth and final Distant Lands special, Wizard City, which sends Peppermint Butler back to the very beginning of his own story, starting over as just another inexperienced student at a school for wizards, his checkered past and his uncomfortable connections quietly shadowing him, even as he tries to learn the mystic arts through the front door for what might be the first time in his long, strange existence. It's the lightest and most purely comedic of the four specials, and I don't think that lightness is an accident either. After a whole series spent letting Peppermint Butler exist as an unexplained, slightly sinister background presence, the show finally gives him room to be a person working at something, failing at it sometimes, starting over the way anyone starting over has to, and it does that instead of ever cashing in his darkness for one more dramatic reveal. Heroism in this show, again and again, doesn't look like the thing on the poster. Sometimes it looks like a small butler holding a door open to somewhere nobody else wants to go because somebody has to and nobody else will. And sometimes, just as tellingly, it looks like that same butler getting to be ordinary for once, getting to be a beginner in a classroom instead of a keeper of secrets in someone else's story. And then there's Marceline, who I want to spend a genuine moment with here, because her particular kind of endurance is a form of heroism this show almost never calls by that name, and I think that omission is deliberate rather than careless. She's approximately 1,000 years old by the time the main events of the show take place, half demon, half human, sustained on shades of red rather than blood itself, which makes her particular vampirism something stranger and more poetic than the traditional version. She was there during the Mushroom War. She was there in the immediate aftermath, a small child wandering the ruins with nobody but a stuffed bear, and, for a while, a man named Simon who protected her before the crown finished taking him apart. Picture what a single one of those 1,000 years must have actually felt like from the inside, let alone all of them stacked one on top of another. Picture watching every single friend you make age and change and eventually stop, over and over, century after century, while you remain exactly as you were, exactly as young, carrying every single one of those losses forward into the next 100 years and the next 100 after that, with no end in sight and no promise that there ever will be one. She has outlived everyone she has ever loved, watched every single person she's cared about change beyond recognition or simply run out of time. And she's done it without a sword, without a title, without anyone standing behind her singing a theme song about her adventures. What she's done instead, for 1,000 years, is survive and keep something like warmth alive inside herself, despite every reason the world gave her not to, and eventually let that warmth reach back out toward Simon, toward Princess Bubblegum, toward Finn and Jake, toward anyone patient enough to wait for her to trust them. That's not the kind of heroism you get a statue for. It's the kind you only notice if you're willing to sit with someone long enough to see what it actually costs them to keep showing up decade after decade, century after century, without ever once being asked to. There's one more piece of Marceline's story worth bringing in here, because it isn't only her survival that reads as a quiet, uncredited form of heroism. It's also the specific patience she brings to her long, complicated relationship with Princess Bubblegum. The two of them share a closeness that predates the show's own timeline, a friendship that curdled at some point into distance, into years of careful politeness, standing in for whatever warmth used to be there. The show lets that distance sit, unresolved, for season after season, occasionally letting it surface. Most memorably in the third season episode, What Was Missing, where the two of them, stripped of most of their possessions by a creature that steals the things people value most, end up singing at each other across a room, Marceline's song landing with a specificity and an ache that made a great many viewers, in the years since, feel fairly certain about what they were actually watching unfold. But the show doesn't rush the thaw. It lets Marceline keep showing up, keep being present, Keep being the person Bubblegum can call. When something in the kingdom goes wrong, even during the years when the space between them was at its widest, and it isn't until the finale that any of that patient showing up gets to resolve into something plainly, finally spoken. That patience is its own kind of bravery, the unglamorous kind, the kind that doesn't get set to music and doesn't get a sword fight. Just years of choosing to stay reachable to someone even when reaching back seems unlikely, on the chance that one day it might not be. None of these people, Root Beer Guy or BMO or Peppermint Butler or Marceline, ever get called the hero of Adventure Time. The show never crowns them. It doesn't need to. It just keeps quietly proving, episode after episode, that the actual load-bearing work of decency in this world is being distributed across dozens of people who never asked for recognition and mostly never got it, while the one person whose name is on the marquee spends a startling amount of his own screen time being manipulative or controlling or simply outclassed by whoever happened to be standing nearby when the real crisis hit. Which brings us, at last, to the place all of this has actually been pointing toward the whole time, which is the finale. Because if you want to know what a show genuinely believes about its own central question, you look at what happens in the moment it finally has to answer it. The series finale, Come Along With Me, gathers essentially everyone the show has ever introduced onto a single battlefield, all at once, for what was originally supposed to be the climax of an entirely different conflict, the Great Gum War between Princess Bubblegum's kingdom and the estranged relatives who'd spent the whole final season plotting against her. And then, in the middle of all that, something far older and far worse gets summoned into the land of Oo. Golb, the entity the Lich himself describes as an object of devotion, a being older than the universe, embodying pure chaos and disorder the way the Lich himself embodies the inevitability of death. Golb arrives through a portal Betty Groff, Simon's fiancée, has spent a considerable portion of her own storyline quietly working toward, though even she doesn't seem to have fully understood what she was inviting in until it was already there, vast and wrong, swallowing entire chunks of the battlefield and reducing everything it touches to simplified, chaotic versions of what they used to be. And here is where I want you to picture the scene as clearly as you can, because the details matter. Finn, along with Simon and Betty, ends up swallowed inside Golb's own body, a space the show renders as something closer to a digestive tract than a room, walls that pulse and fold, and occasionally spit out simplified, screaming echoes of whatever Golb has already consumed. Trying to help his father get free during the chaos, Finn loses his robotic arm entirely, his forearm gone in an instant. The show's designated hero rendered at the exact moment the entire world's fate hangs in the balance, physically diminished, trapped, and unable to fight his way out through any conventional means whatsoever. Outside, Jake sees the treehouse, the actual physical home this whole story has been built around, the exact structure grown from Shoko's own buried remains 1,000 years earlier, get destroyed in front of him, splinters and leaves, and years of accumulated memory scattering across a battlefield that used to be a front yard, and the show lets him have a real breakdown over it, shrinking himself down, curling into himself in something close to a full collapse, before BMO comforts him with a song rather than a plan. Picture it as plainly as you can. The sky over the Candy Kingdom has gone the wrong color, a deep, wrong red that doesn't belong to sunset or storm, and the thing hanging in it is too large for the eye to hold in one glance, folding and unfolding in ways that don't track with how solid objects are supposed to move. The ground underneath everyone's feet is already littered with what used to be but soldiers on both sides of a war that, an hour earlier, had seemed like the biggest thing anyone in Oo would ever have to face. And now all of that, the whole Candy versus Gumbaldian conflict that the entire final season had been building toward, gets swallowed by its own footnote because something vaster and older has just stepped through a hole in the world and started eating the battlefield alive, turning gum guardians and banana guards alike into simplified, screaming versions of themselves. That song turns out to be the key to everything. BMO begins singing, and the resulting sound creates something like a barrier against Gogolb's creatures, and once Princess Bubblegum and Marceline notice what's happening, once they realize that Golb's essential nature, pure discord, makes it vulnerable specifically to harmony, to voices joined together rather than fighting apart, the entire assembled population of the battlefield begins singing along, not fighting, singing every voice they can gather, layered together, weakening the oldest and most powerful threat this world has ever produced, not through force, but through the simple, communal act of making a sound together on purpose. That detail alone is worth sitting with for a long moment before we move any further, because it's the show's own final, unambiguous statement on what actually beats the darkest thing it ever created. Not a sword, not a chosen hero swinging at the right moment. A song sung by everyone at once, with Finn as one small voice among dozens rather than the decisive blow. And even that collective harmony isn't what finally ends the threat for good. It only opens a gap wide enough for Finn and Simon to escape. Betty stays behind, alone, inside Golb, because she realizes the Ice King's crown has reverted, in that moment, to its original, primal wishing form, the same crown that once transformed a curious young dinosaur and then transformed Simon, now sitting there waiting to grant whoever wears it their single truest desire. Her first wish, spoken plainly into the chaos around her, asks simply for Golb to be banished, to cease existing. It doesn't work. Golb is too vast, too old, too fundamentally beyond the reach of a wish, that direct and that blunt. So she makes a different wish instead, one that isn't really about defeating anything at all. She wishes to keep Simon safe. And because that wish is the truest thing in her, the only thing that's ever actually been true in her for the entirety of the impossible journey that brought her here across 1,000 years of time, she was never supposed to have access to, the crown honors it in the only way available to it, by merging her entirely with Golb itself, transforming her into something new, something the show and its wiki alike simply call Golbetti, a being that can apparently be reasoned with now, that can choose consciously and willingly, to leave Ooh rather than destroy it. Betty exits through the sky, through the same rift Golb originally arrived through, and Simon is left standing there in the wreckage, mourning her, Marceline's hand finding his shoulder, having gotten his sanity and his old life back at the exact cost of the one person who spent centuries making sure he'd have somewhere worth coming back to. There's a version of Betty Groff that the show constructs slowly and carefully, long before she ever gets to do the thing she's ultimately remembered for. She arrives properly in the fifth season episode simply called Betty, stepping forward out of a time before the Mushroom War, using mechanics the show leaves somewhat deliberately vague, a time wish, a time portal, the specifics mattering less than the fact of her arrival itself, a woman out of sequence, looking for a fiancé she left behind in a world that no longer exists. What she finds when she gets here isn't Simon, it's the Ice King, and the show spends real time letting her sit with that discovery rather than rushing her toward a solution. She doesn't immediately know how to fix what 1,000 years and a cursed crown have done to the man she loved, and for a while, she simply has to live inside that gap, the same gap Marceline had been living inside for centuries, the space between the person you remember and the person now wearing their face. What Betty does with that gap, across the seasons that follow, is turn herself into something increasingly unrecognizable in pursuit of closing it. She acquires magical knowledge most sensible people in Ooh would consider far too dangerous to touch. She takes measures the show is honest enough to frame as genuinely reckless rather than simply devoted, culminating in an image that recurs across her later appearances. A woman assembling rituals on flying carpets with sky witches and con artists, pursuing power for a single, narrow purpose that has nothing to do with saving the world and everything to do with saving one specific person in it. By the time the finale arrives, Betty has effectively become the finale's own hidden engine, the person whose private, obsessive project turns out to be tangled up with the summoning of the single oldest, worst threat this world has ever produced, though even she doesn't seem to fully grasp what she's actually opening until it's already standing over the battlefield. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, because it complicates the sacrifice that she eventually makes in a way that makes it more human rather than less. Betty isn't a clean, uncomplicated saint who shows up at the last possible second to rescue everyone through pure selflessness. She's a woman whose love for one specific person pushed her into choices that helped create the very catastrophe she then had to give herself up entirely to end. Her heroism, when it finally arrives, isn't separate from her flaws. It grows directly out of them, the same tunnel-visioned devotion that endangered the whole world becoming, at the very last possible moment, the exact thing that saves it, once she finally points that devotion at protecting Simon rather than at reclaiming him. The land of Ooh isn't saved in the end by a hero swinging a sword at a monster. It's saved by an entire community singing together, and by one woman's decision to disappear into the very thing threatening everyone she loved rather than let it win. Finn is present for all of it. Finn is not the one who does it. He's swallowed, disarmed, rescued, and ultimately a bystander to the actual decisive act, standing there watching someone else make the sacrifice the story's whole shape had spent 9 seasons implying would eventually belong to him. I think that's worth saying as plainly as I can, because it's easy to let a finale wash over you in the excitement of everything happening at once. All those years of accumulated story finally colliding in one enormous battlefield and miss what's actually being handed to whom in the process. The show spent 9 seasons building toward a final confrontation, and when the final confrontation actually arrived, it quietly, without any fanfare at all, took the decisive moment away from its title character and gave it to a woman who barely appears in half the episodes of the show, and to a song sung by everyone at once. That's not an accident of plotting. That's the argument, stated about as clearly as a show like this one is ever going to state anything, that the word hero was never really about Finn specifically. It was about whoever happened to be capable of the thing that actually needed doing, in whatever moment that need arose, and the show had spent its entire run quietly rotating that role through an enormous cast of people, most of whom never got their name on the poster. There's one more layer to this, and it's the strangest one, and it's the one where I need to be most careful about labeling speculation as speculation, because we're now heading into territory where the show gestures at something without ever fully confirming it in plain, unambiguous terms. The show's mythology, particularly in its later seasons, builds out a cosmology involving what it calls catalyst comets, cosmic forces that periodically arrive on Earth and, in some sense, the show never fully mechanizes into hard rules, choose to be born into the world as living beings. The Lich is explicitly tied to a green catalyst comet, understood within the show's own internal logic as a physical manifestation of inevitable death, of the ending that eventually comes for everything, worlds and species and stars included. Finn, the show suggests through visual and narrative parallels rather than through a single character stating it outright, is tied to a corresponding blue comet, understood as a kind of counterpart force, heroism, goodness, the choice to act rather than simply exist. And crucially, the show implies, though it never spells this out in a single, clean line of dialogue, that this blue comet has chosen to incarnate before, in other eras, as other beings, expressing that same fundamental orientation toward the world in whatever form the moment required. Finn, in other words, may not be the first hero the universe has produced using this particular mechanism. He may simply be the current one. Before we get to how ambiguous that particular piece of mythology actually is, I want to bring in a related thread that the show states far more directly, because I think it complicates the picture in exactly the right way. In the 5th season episode The Vault, Finn starts sleepwalking, thrashing violently through the tree fort at night, in the grip of a recurring nightmare about a strange green ghost he first encountered years earlier in a much smaller, quieter episode called The Creeps. Jake and BMO, worried, help him hypnotize himself and descend into what the show calls his own inner vault, a place where repressed memory apparently gets stored, the way like old furniture gets stored in an attic nobody wants to clean out. What Finn finds down there, confirmed plainly by the show, rather than left as some background implication, is a sequence of his own past lives. A comet, a butterfly, some kind of shapeless blob from a higher dimension, and then, in far more vivid and specific detail than any of the others, a young woman named Shoko, green-skinned, one-armed, riding a white tiger through the earliest, roughest years of the Candy Kingdom's history, working as a thief for a gang called the Bath Boys. Shoko is not, by any reasonable measure, a hero. She's a survivor of a genuinely rough childhood, abandoned by her own birth family, her arm traded away for a piece of technology before she was old enough to have any say in the matter, and she makes her living stealing things for people who treat her as disposable. When her gang orders her to steal an amulet from a very young Princess Bubblegum, whom she's befriended, she has to choose between betraying someone who's shown her real kindness and facing violent consequences for refusing. She chooses the betrayal. She steals the amulet, and it's only much later, mutated by the same radioactive waste, that runs beneath the earliest version of the Candy Kingdom, dying quietly at the base of a small sapling that will one day grow into the very tree Finn's own home is built inside of, that her ghost is finally pushed to return the amulet and let the guilt she carried across an entire lifetime finally rest. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it's one of the more genuinely striking pieces of evidence for tonight's whole argument, and unlike the comet mythology we're about to get into, it isn't speculative at all. The show states directly that this is who Finn used to be. Not a legendary warrior, not an ancient force of cosmic goodness. A frightened, disabled child thief who betrayed the one person who'd been kind to her, and who spent the rest of her short, hard life carrying that betrayal until death and time and a very literal tree finally gave her the chance to set it right. If Finn's soul really has traveled through comets and butterflies and thieves on its way to becoming the boy in the green backpack we spend 10 seasons following, then whatever essential goodness people want to locate inside him, whatever quality makes him the hero rather than just the narrator, clearly isn't a constant. It comes and goes across lifetimes, the same way it comes and goes across a single life, the same way it moved through Billy and receded, the same way it curdled briefly into rage in the Fire Kingdom and then came back, even reaching all the way back through his own reincarnated history. The show refuses to hand Finn a clean, uninterrupted lineage of virtue. It hands him a thief who did wrong, and then, centuries later, and one entire life removed from the wrongdoing, finally got to make it right. There's one more figure worth bringing briefly into this before we head toward the final stretch of tonight, because his ending gives us a kind of quiet coda to everything we've been building. Simon Petrikov, freed from the crown at the cost of Betty's own existence, doesn't get handed a triumphant return to heroism once his sanity comes back. He gets handed old age, grief, and a world that's spent 1,000 years becoming something he never would have predicted, and what he chooses to do with what's left of his life, in the material that extends beyond the main series, is become a teacher, someone who spends his remaining years explaining the history of magical artifacts to students who have no idea the man in front of them once wore the most dangerous one this world ever produced. That's not a small incidental detail either. A man whose entire life was unmade by a magical artifact ends up devoting what's left of it to teaching other people about magical artifacts, carrying the specific, hard earned discipline of somebody who knows exactly what these objects cost because he paid the cost personally across 1,000 years he never asked for. Nobody calls that heroism either. It doesn't involve a sword or a crisis or a crowd cheering his name. It's simply an old man deciding, after everything, to keep being useful to people in the smallest, steadiest way still available to him, which might be the most honest definition this entire show ever quietly offers for what the word was supposed to mean in the first place. I want to flag clearly that the next piece, the Catalyst Comet mythology specifically, is one of the more genuinely ambiguous corners of the show's mythology, something the material gestures at through pattern and implication rather than through direct confirmation. So take what follows as informed interpretation rather than settled fact. But if you take that implication seriously, even provisionally, it reframes everything we've talked about tonight in a way that I think is worth sitting with before we come to a close. If Finn's decency, his impulse toward heroism, is something older than his individual life, something that existed before him and will presumably continue in some form after him, then the specific person wearing that decency at any given moment becomes almost incidental to the larger pattern the decency itself represents. Finn didn't invent goodness from scratch through sheer force of personal will. He's simply the current vessel for something that has apparently been looking for a way to express itself for as long as the universe has had a green comet looking for the opposite. It's a strange thing to sit with. The idea that your own kindness might be older than you are, might have visited the world before in shapes you'd never recognize as kin to your own, a butterfly's brief flight, a comet's silent pass through the upper atmosphere, a shapeless blob drifting through some higher dimension nobody in Oo has ever fully mapped. It would mean that when Finn finally does put himself between danger and someone he loves, the thing moving through him in that instant isn't purely his own invention, purely a product of the specific childhood Joshua and Margaret gave him in that tree fort. It would mean he's borrowing something, the way all of us are probably borrowing something whenever we manage, on our better days, to be kind to a stranger for no reason we could fully explain if you asked us to. Which means that when we ask whether Finn was the real hero of Adventure Time, we might actually be asking a slightly wrong question. The realer question might be whether heroism, as this show understands it, was ever supposed to belong to any single person at all, or whether it was always meant to be understood as something that moves through people, temporarily, unevenly, landing wherever it's needed, and then moving on, the way it apparently moved through Billy, before it moved through Finn, the way it moved through Lumpy Space Princess for one crucial mini-series, the way it moved through Susan Strong on an island that had never once let her be anything other than a weapon, the way it moved through Betty at the exact moment the entire world needed it most. Before we get there, I want to say one more thing about Jake, because it would be easy in an essay built around dismantling Finn's claim to the word hero to accidentally let Jake slide into that empty seat instead, and I don't think the show wants that either. Jake is, by almost universal agreement among people who love this show, the easiest character to love in the entire run of it. He's funny, he's warm, he's a genuinely gifted cook. He gives advice that's frequently wrong in its specifics and almost always right in its underlying spirit, and he seems to have arrived, more completely than anyone else in OO, at something like peace with the basic terms of being alive. He talks about a period of minor criminal activity in his own past without dwelling on it, without turning it into an origin story, just letting it sit there as one honest fact among many. He knows, and appears to have made a kind of unhurried peace with the knowledge that he will die before Finn does, that a magical dog's lifespan simply isn't built to match a human boy's, and when the show shows him a vision of his own old age in the episode Dungeon Train, white-muzzled and slow, but still unmistakably himself, he doesn't flinch away from it. He looks at it, integrates it, and keeps going, the same way he seems to integrate almost everything else that happens to him. And the show does, eventually, confirm through the material that extends the story past its own finale that Jake dies sometime after the events we watch play out, off screen, without ceremony, marked only by a tattoo Finn is later shown carrying on his own chest, Jake's shape resting directly over his heart. But here's the thing worth noticing about Jake in the specific context of tonight's question. Nobody, not the show, not its most devoted fans, not even Jake himself, has ever seriously argued that he's the real hero either. He's not positioned that way. He's positioned as something arguably more important and definitely rarer, which is the person who makes heroism, whoever happens to be carrying it in a given moment, survivable. He's the one who shows up. He's the one who translates Lady Rainicorn's Korean when nobody else bothers to, who raises 5 children who age from infancy to adulthood in a matter of days, without once seeming to resent how fast it all goes, who is, by his own account, and the show's quiet insistence, simply gifted at being alive, rather than gifted at saving the world. That's not a lesser thing than heroism. It might be the thing heroism actually depends on in order to mean anything at all. A hero with nobody steady standing beside them is just a person making increasingly reckless decisions alone in the dark, and Jake, more than anyone else in this entire cast, is the reason Finn's recklessness so rarely got the chance to curdle into something permanently destructive. He wasn't the hero. He was the reason the hero got to keep being forgivable. It's worth stepping back for just a moment here and thinking about how unusual this whole approach actually is when you set it against the wider tradition Adventure Time is quietly working inside of. Most fantasy stories, going back centuries, going back to the oldest myths people told each other before there was any such thing as television, tend to organize themselves around a single chosen figure, someone marked out from birth or by circumstance, someone whose specialness is the entire engine of the plot. The prophecy names one child, The sword, it only comes free in one hand. The story exists to follow that one person's rise, and then everyone else in the world, however charming or capable, ultimately exists to support, threaten, or reflect the chosen one's journey back to them. It's a satisfying shape, and it's satisfying for a real reason, because it flatters something in us that wants to believe our own life might secretly be the one the universe is organizing itself around. There's a kind of comfort in imagining that somewhere out there, a story is quietly building toward you specifically, that the seemingly ordinary shape of your days is actually a disguise. The universe put on you until the right moment arrives to take it off. Adventure Time spends its first couple of seasons gesturing at that same shape, letting Finn wear the Chosen One's costume, and then it spends every season after that quietly, patiently taking the costume back off him, piece by piece, and handing pieces of it to other people instead, as if it wanted its youngest viewers to grow up understanding something a little harder and a little more useful than the comforting version of that fantasy. Billy gets it first and loses it to age and loneliness. Fern gets a piece of it and is destroyed by the unfairness of never being allowed to keep it. Lumpy Space Princess gets it for exactly one miniseries and then goes back to being treated as comic relief the moment the crisis passes. Susan Strong gets it on an island that had spent her entire childhood insisting she could only ever be a weapon. Betty gets the biggest piece of all right at the very end and pays for it with everything she has left to give. That's not the shape of a chosen one story. That's the shape of something closer to a mosaic. Dozens of small, imperfect pieces of colored glass, none of them mattering such on their own, all of them together adding up to something that, from far enough away, looks almost like a single, coherent picture of a world worth saving. I think that's a genuinely rarer and braver thing for a show to build, especially a show that spent its entire existence being sold to children with a boy's face on the poster. It would have been so much easier to just let Finn be the chosen one and let everyone else orbit him. The show chose the harder, more honest structure instead, and I don't think it did that by accident, given how carefully everything else in this world was built. I think that's actually the kindest possible answer to the question we started with tonight, and I think it's the answer the show itself, in its quieter, more honest moments, keeps trying to hand us. Finn was never the real hero, not because he wasn't brave, and not because he wasn't good, but because the show never actually believed in a single real hero to begin with. It believed in a rotating, shared, deeply imperfect practice of showing up for the people around you, a practice that Finn participated in sometimes beautifully and sometimes disastrously, the same as everyone else in Ooh, the same as Billy, before his legend curdled into loneliness, the same as Fern in his brief, desperate attempt to matter, the same as Root Beer Guy dying questily off screen for a cause nobody bothered to film, the same as Susan Strong choosing, at the end of everything, to keep the name she built for herself rather than the one she was given, the same as Betty disappearing into a chaos god because it was the only wish left that could actually save the person she loved. There's something worth naming directly about why a show would go to all this trouble, decade after decade, character after character, rather than simply letting its title character be the uncomplicated hero the format would have made so much easier to sell. I think it has something to do with who this show was actually made for, underneath the marketing about a boy and his dog. Children, more than almost anyone else, are told constantly that heroism belongs to a specific kind of person, the strongest, the bravest, the one chosen by prophecy or birth or narrative convenience, and that the rest of us are simply supposed to stand around admiring whoever that turns out to be. Adventure Time seems to have understood, somewhere in its writer's room, that this was a genuinely dangerous thing to teach a child, or anyone else for that matter, because it quietly excuses everyone who isn't the chosen one from ever having to try. If heroism only belongs to Finn, then nobody watching at home needs to worry about becoming the kind of person who does the hard, unglamorous, unrewarded thing when it actually matters. But if heroism belongs to whoever happens to be paying attention in the moment it's needed, to root beer guy on his way to a telemarketing shift, to lumpy space princess standing immune in a kingdom that stopped recognizing anyone else, to a small robot floating alone through the coldest reaches of space, then suddenly the show isn't just telling a story about somebody else's bravery. It's making a quiet, patient argument that the capacity for that bravery was never reserved for anybody special in the first place. It was always sitting there, available, waiting for whoever happened to be standing closest when the moment finally asked for it. That's a genuinely generous thing for a cartoon to spend a decade insisting on, and I don't think it's an accident that the people who grew up watching it, who are largely the people watching this video tonight, carried that insistence with them into adulthood without necessarily being able to name where it came from. Root Beer Guy never got a statue. Fern never got to hear anyone call him real. Billy died alone, uncertain whether any of it had mattered. Susan spent years of her life as a weapon before anyone let her be a person. Cinnamon Bun spent years as a joke before anyone let him be a knight. And Finn, the boy the whole show is nominally named after, spent large stretches of his own story being manipulative, controlling, occasionally villainous, occasionally simply outmatched by whoever happened to be standing closer to the actual crisis, and ultimately, in the moment that counted most, unable to save the world through his own strength at all, needing to be sung out of the belly of a chaos god by the collective voice of everyone who loved him. There's something almost unbearably tender about that, if you let yourself actually sit inside it rather than rushing past it toward the credits. A show that could have simply let its hero be a hero, cleanly, uncomplicatedly, the way 100 other cartoons aimed at the exact same age group were content to do, instead spent a full decade quietly, patiently building the case that nobody in this world was ever meant to carry that weight by themselves. Not the boy with the sword, not the ancient warrior he modeled himself after, not even the girl who eventually merged herself with the oldest, worst thing this world ever produced just to keep one broken old man safe. Every single one of them needed somebody else standing nearby, ready to catch what they couldn't hold on their own, and the show never once apologized for that, never treated it as a weakness in its own storytelling that the hero kept needing rescuing. It treated it as the truest thing it had to say about what actually keeps a world like this one standing after the worst day it ever had. Maybe that's the whole point. Maybe a show built this carefully out of ruins and candy and 1,000 years of accumulated grief was never going to let a single sword-swinging boy carry the entire weight of what heroism actually means. Maybe it was always going to spread that weight out, quietly, across an entire world of people who never asked to be tested, and let each of them carry whatever small, unglamorous piece of it happened to land in their hands. Root Beer Guy's piece was a life he gave up without anyone watching. Susan's piece was choosing forgiveness in both directions, toward Frida and toward herself. Cinnamon Bun's piece was simply becoming, slowly and without ceremony, the person everyone had already decided he couldn't be. Betty's piece was 1,000 years of refusing to let go, and then one final wish that cost her everything she had left. Fern's piece was trying, badly and desperately, to be something he was never given the chance to actually become. And Finn's piece, in the end, might simply have been being present, again and again, close enough to all of it, close enough to keep showing up even when showing up wasn't enough on its own, which is maybe the only kind of heroism any of us actually get access to in the end anyway. The small, unglamorous kind, the kind that doesn't get a theme song, the kind that just means you didn't leave when you could have. Somewhere in the land of Ooh tonight, if the show's own internal logic still holds the way it always has, there's a tree standing over the ruins of an old treehouse, with a sword buried somewhere up in its branches, waiting for whoever eventually climbs high enough to find it. There's a penguin ruling a small ice kingdom with a wife and a crown, and absolutely no memory of ever having been anything else. There's a butler somewhere in the Candy Kingdom's lower levels, doing something none of his fellow citizens would sleep well knowing about, doing it anyway, because somebody has to. There's a robot playing a video game alone in a quiet room, perfectly content, humming something that sounds a little like a song about time. There's an old man somewhere standing at the front of a classroom, telling a group of students things he learned the hardest way a person can learn anything, and not one of them has any idea what it cost him to know it. None of them are the hero. All of them, on any given night, might be the only thing standing between somebody they love and the dark. That was always the actual shape of this story, underneath the sword fights and the theme song, and the boy whose name got put on the marquee, simply because he happened to be standing closest to the camera most often. A whole world of people, ordinary and strange and quietly brave in ways nobody bothered to film, taking turns. The land of Ooh will keep, the way it always has, candy and ruin both, real in equal measure, waiting there in the dark for whoever needs it next. If tonight found you somewhere warm, or somewhere quiet, or somewhere in between, I hope it did what it was supposed to do, which is give you something gentle to carry into sleep. If you found something in this worth sitting with, I'd love it if you left a like on your way out, and if you want more nights like this one spent down in the deeper rooms of this world, consider subscribing so the next one finds you when it's ready. Rest well. The adventure, whoever it actually belongs to, continues.